Okay, going back to Max Keiser at maxkeiser.com quickly, you basically answered my next question in the last segment, but in layman's, simple terms.
Yes.
Do you see Asia plunging next, or how far will Europe plunge? Do you think the Eurozone's going to break up? The Germans are saying that major German newspapers are calling for a Deutsche Reich zone that only has the richest countries in Europe that are part of it. So what do you see happening with the euro? I know you can't guess this exactly, but you've been very accurate in the past. How do you see this unfolding? Who do you see going down next? When does this really start to hit the U.S.?
Right. Well, as you say, I've been pretty good at framing this and predicting this. What you have to understand is you've got a multi-trillion-dollar hedge fund business. A hedge fund is just a fund that is not bound by any restrictions in terms of the types of bets that they can make and the leverage that they have at their availability. And what they do is they go from currency to currency, and they ferret out which ones are the weakest. They then scare the bejesus out of the folks. They float rumors about the economic collapse. They crash the economy. They make a quick $100 billion or so, and then they move on. And from the Eurozone, I think that they've beat up the euro pretty good here in the last few weeks. I think the next stop is the British pound. The British pound, they've got a new government in Britain. They're trying to bring in some reforms. They're talking about bringing in banking reform. So I think that next time we talk, we'll be talking about the tragic fall of the British pound. They'll beat that up for a while. And then they either will go back to Eurozone and attack the euro, or they may come back to the U.S., because the U.S. is always the currency that these guys know best. They know how to crash it in the most efficient manner, and it's always in their pocket. They can always crash the dollar. That's something they can always do for a quick buck, but you can't do it 100% of the time. You've got to take turns crashing different currencies at different times. So I think, the way I see it, the next is the British pound. The Japanese yen is kind of a possibility at some point. Their economy has been gone now 20 straight years of deflation, and it's still highly problematic. They import something like 100% of their energy, so it's really at the mercies of the global economic system. So that's always a nice one to go in there occasionally. But they use the yen really as what's called a funding currency. In other words, they borrow in yen because it's so cheap, and they use that to go attack a country like the UK or the Eurozone. So it depends on which country has a really weak currency. They use that to borrow, and they go attack another currency. When I was in Reykjavik, right before that economy collapsed, I sat in the 101 hotel in the sushi bar, and I talked to some bankers from Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns, and they said, look, in about 6 months, we're going to attack Iceland, and we're going to crash the Icelandic krona. And they weren't shy about talking about it, and it's exactly what they did. Now, a few years later, they're finally getting around to putting some people in jail for counterfeiting and securities fraud and all kinds of other crimes. And hopefully they'll put somebody in jail to sit next to Bernie Madoff, and hopefully Lloyd Blankfein will be there shortly.
And if we just continue to point out the emperor's butt naked and isn't wearing any golden outfit, like the little 3-year-old in the Emperor's New Clothes parable. In fact, guys, print me the Emperor's New Clothes parable. I want to read that next hour on air. If we just point out the obvious, it's going to implode. Max, did you see Fox News, the New York Times, AFP, Reuters in the last month all come out with a psyop and say, yes, the troops are helping grow the opium, because if we don't grow it, Al-Qaeda will get the money. I mean, this had been coming out that our government was there for the opium, $500 billion a year, and shipping it in. And the Russians had said this. But now they're so arrogant, they hide it in plain view. It'd be like President Obama being naked at the podium and saying he wasn't naked, and we're not supposed to point out he's naked. So it's some type of mind control thing where they just come out and say, yeah, we grow the opium.
Have you ever talked to Catherine Austin Fitts about this?
Yeah, the big red button.
She's got an excellent, a lot of work on the CIA, Afghani opium crops. And also, you know, a lot of these hedge funds that you read about, this came out during the savings and loan collapse. They discovered that many of the hedge funds were actually backed by the government and CIA and other organizations. So, and back in the 2008 crash, when Hank Paulson put the gun to Congress's head and said, give us $700 billion, we're going to crash the economy, a lot of people in Congress were actually short bank stocks. They used an exchange-traded fund, which was making negative bets against bank stocks. So those congressmen were actually making money as those bank stocks were collapsing. So these guys are just fully invested in the collapse, and that's why I call them suicide bankers, because they have a fundamentalist belief in capitalism as their religion, and they're willing to blow themselves up in the name of their religious belief in fanatical capitalism.
But
now,
today,
let me, before I forget, Meredith Whitney, who's a very popular analyst now, she's the one who called out Citibank a few years ago, right before the crash. She said this, quote, financial reform will cause, quote, tragic unemployment levels for an extended period of time. You see what she's saying? If you try to reform us, then unemployment levels will be tragic for an extended period of time. That's an outright threat. That's just an outright threat coming from Wall Street. If you try to reform us, you're never going to get a job again. You know, that's just outright tyranny. I mean, what else can you call it?
You're absolutely right. Well said, Max Keiser, and they just continue to threaten. Let's talk to Tom in Connecticut. You're on the air.
Hi. Yeah, this is perfect what you're talking about. Because I did want to comment on something you said yesterday, Alex, and that was you said it was good that they were arresting the bankers in Iceland, but then you said it's okay. You know, we have the great local bankers down the street where you can get a loan for a car. But a private banker is a private banker is a private banker no matter how small they are, how big they are. They have the power through fractional reserve lending to create money out of nothing. And what we need is public credit directly through our government. We need to take the responsibility.
Well, let me say this. I mean, I'm all for state banks, but that's still a bank. And it's not going to be able to compete if it doesn't have the fractional system. And this is a very complex issue. But local banks, some are good, some are bad. The point is, we don't want the mega 6 banks in the U.S., several others globally, but there's no more than 10, any way you slice it. So just for simplicity, we don't want the mega 10 banks to have the regulatory power to scoop up the smaller banks, because then we're really in trouble. Max Keiser.
In North Dakota, they have a banking system which is sound, because they passed some laws to get rid of a lot of the abuses. And Ellen Brown, who's a very fine journalist, has done a lot of work. If you type in Ellen Brown in the search engine and search North Dakota banks, it is possible to run banks in an equitable, fair way. And North Dakota, surprisingly, for people probably don't know about this, they actually have some pretty decent banks, because they have decided to not try to run with the wolves and to simply get in the very simple business of...
But it's the same thing with Texas banks. They're some of the wealthiest in the country, and the Texas Banking Association has come out and said, we're not selling derivatives. We're not the big mega banks. They are dangerous. And so that's important, to be friendly with regional banks, to be able to defeat the big banks. And then later, if we want to change something at that level and fix abuses at the local level, I think it's great. But Tom, finish your point.
Yeah, well, that is excellent that Max brought up Ellen Brown in her book, The Web of Debt, in the Bank of North Dakota. No, the Bank of North Dakota is a state-owned and operated bank. It is true sovereign money. We need a sovereign monetary system, not a private debt money system, what we have now, where they have the power to create money. They are like a mafia. We have to realize that the private bankers of the world are like a global mafia, and we have to stand up to them like the people of a village stand up to the mafia and run them out of town.
I agree. Tom, well said. Absolutely. Currency should be a symbol of exchange, not the actual energy. You know, it doesn't have the value. It's an agreed upon mode of exchange, and we need to get back to what we had pre-1913.